The breaking point wasn't dramatic. It wasn't screaming or throwing things or discovering an affair. It was Tuesday morning, and I was making coffee for two people who barely spoke anymore. I was 32, married for 8 years to David, the man I thought I'd grow old with. We'd met in college during our junior year, in a sociology class where the professor made us debate controversial topics. David argued against something I believed passionately in, and I spent the entire class period dismantling his points. After class, he walked up to me and said, "Want to grab coffee and continue destroying my worldview?" I was hooked. We dated through our senior year, moved in together after graduation, spent our 20s building what everyone called the perfect relationship. David got his accounting degree and landed a job at a prestigious firm. I went to nursing school, graduated with honors, got hired at the biggest hospital in the city. We saved for a house, planned elaborate vacations, had dinner with each other's parents every Sunday. Our wedding was exactly what I'd dreamed of since I was little. Beach ceremony in Mexico, 150 guests, a reception that lasted until 3 a.m. David cried when he saw me walking down the aisle. I cried during my vows. Everyone said we were soulmates, that they'd never seen two people more meant for each other. For the first few years, they were right. We finished each other's sentences, laughed at the same stupid jokes, had the kind of chemistry that made our friends simultaneously jealous and slightly nauseated. David would leave little notes in my lunch bag. I'd surprise him with tickets to see his favorite band. We talked about everything, planned for everything, dreamed together about the life we were building. But somewhere around year 5, things started shifting in ways so subtle I didn't recognize them at first. David began working later. Not every night, just once or twice a week initially, then more often. "Big case," he'd say, or "busy season," or "the partners are really watching my hours right now." I understood. I was picking up extra shifts at the hospital myself, saving for the down payment on a bigger house, the one with the nursery we'd started talking about. The conversations became shorter, less about dreams and more about logistics. Who was picking up groceries? Whose turn it was to call the cable company? Whether we should refinance the mortgage? Important stuff, but not the kind of talk that made me fall in love with him in the first place. I started noticing other things. David stopped asking about my patients, the ones I used to tell him stories about over dinner. He'd nod when I talked, but I could see his mind was elsewhere. When I asked about his work, he'd give me abbreviated answers, nothing like the detailed accounts he used to share about office politics and difficult clients. We still had sex, but it felt routine, scheduled almost, like another item on our to-do list between paying bills and calling our parents. The spontaneity was gone. The connection during it was gone. Afterward, we'd lie next to each other in the dark, each lost in our own thoughts, and I'd wonder when intimacy had become just another obligation. I tried to bring it up once, about 6 months before everything fell apart. "Do you feel like we're drifting?" I asked one Saturday morning over coffee. David looked up from his laptop, where he was doing work that apparently couldn't wait until Monday. "Drifting how?" he asked, but he was already looking back at his screen. I tried to explain, but he kept getting distracted by emails. Finally, I just said, "Never mind," and went to do laundry. We never finished that conversation. The house we'd been so excited to buy started feeling like a beautiful prison. Everything was perfectly coordinated, exactly what we'd planned, but it felt cold somehow. We'd decorated it together, hung photos from our trips, displayed wedding gifts we'd registered for with such excitement, but walking through those rooms felt like touring a museum of our former selves. I began staying late at the hospital more often, not because I had to, but because coming home felt like entering a space where I had to perform being happy. David would be in his home office most evenings, door closed, working on projects that seemed to multiply endlessly. We'd meet in the kitchen around 9 p.m., heat up leftovers, exchange updates about our days that felt more like briefings than conversations. Our friends started commenting, "You two are so busy these days," Rachel would say when we declined another dinner invitation. "When's the last time you went out together?" I'd make excuses about work schedules and demanding jobs, but the truth was, David and I had stopped enjoying each other's company. We'd become polite strangers, sharing living expenses. I remember one particular evening, about 3 months before the Tuesday, that changed everything. David was on his laptop, as usual, and I was reading a book. We were sitting on opposite ends of our expensive couch, the one we'd spent weeks picking out, and the silence felt suffocating. I looked up at him, really looked, and realized I didn't know what he was thinking about anymore. Used to be, I could read his moods, predict his reactions, understand his silences. That night, he might as well have been a stranger. "What are you working on?" I asked, trying to bridge the gap. "Just some client stuff," he said without looking up. Nothing interesting, but it used to be interesting to him. He used to get excited about complex tax situations, animated when explaining legal loopholes. When had his work become nothing interesting to him? And when had my curiosity about it become an interruption? I started paying attention to other couples we knew, really watching them when we went out, which was rare by then. I noticed how Marcus and Jenny touched each other's arms when they talked, how they shared inside jokes, how they seemed genuinely interested in each other's stories. I watched them and felt a deep sadness, not jealousy exactly, but grief for what David and I had lost, without either of us seeming to notice. The loneliness was the worst part. I'd lie in bed next to him, listening to his breathing, feeling more alone than I ever had when I was actually single. At least when I was single, I knew I was alone. This felt like false advertising, like being promised companionship and getting a roommate instead. I started having fantasies about being single again, not about other men exactly, but about the freedom to make decisions without consulting someone who didn't really seem to care about my input anyway, about coming home to a space that was entirely mine, about not having to maintain the pretense of marriage when it felt like we were just going through the motions. Sex became less and less frequent. When it did happen, it felt performative, like we were both checking a box. I'd catch myself thinking about work during it, making mental lists of things I needed to do the next day. Afterward, David would roll over and go to sleep immediately, while I stared at the ceiling, wondering how we'd gotten here. I suggested counseling once, during a particularly tense conversation about money. David had booked a weekend golf trip, without mentioning it to me, and I'd planned a dinner with my sister for the same weekend. "Maybe we should talk to someone," I said, after we'd sorted out the scheduling conflict. About communication, David looked at me like I'd suggested we needed surgery for a paper cut. "We communicate fine, Sarah. We just both have a lot going on right now. Once things settle down at work, we'll have more time for each other." But things never settled down. There was always another project, another deadline, another reason why this wasn't the right time to focus on us. I started to understand that things settling down was a myth David had created to avoid dealing with the fact that our marriage was slowly dying from neglect. I began noticing signs that David felt it too. He'd started going to bed earlier, claiming he was exhausted, but I could hear him scrolling through his phone under the covers. He'd developed a habit of taking long showers in the evening, and I suspected it was just to have some time alone. He'd started buying his own coffee on the way to work, instead of sharing the pot I made each morning. The Tuesday that changed everything started like any other. David was already gone when I woke up, off to his job at the accounting firm, where he'd been promoted twice in 3 years. He was successful, respected, making good money, all the things we'd planned for. But success at work seemed to have replaced any investment in success at home. I made coffee for both of us out of habit, even though he'd started buying his own on the way to work months earlier. I stood in our kitchen, holding 2 mugs of coffee, and suddenly everything felt absurd. Here I was, maintaining a routine for a person who'd already opted out of it, keeping up the appearance of morning rituals for someone who couldn't be bothered to say goodbye before leaving. I was standing there, holding 2 mugs of coffee, when I realized I didn't know what David's favorite song was anymore. We used to make each other playlists, used to argue playfully about music in the car, used to dance in this same kitchen to songs that came on the radio. When was the last time we'd listened to music together? When was the last time David had mentioned a song he liked? Or I'd shared one with him? I didn't know if he still liked his coffee with 2 sugars, or if he'd switched to 1. I didn't know what made him laugh anymore, what kept him awake at night, what he worried about, what he hoped for. I didn't know if he still dreamed about the trip to Italy we'd planned, but never taken, or if he'd given up on that dream entirely. I didn't know if he was happy at work, stressed about his health, concerned about his parents getting older. I didn't know anything about the inner life of the man I'd shared a bed with for 8 years. I'd been living with a stranger for months, maybe years, and I'd been so focused on maintaining the appearance of marriage that I'd forgotten to actually be married. We'd been performing the roles of husband and wife without inhabiting them, going through the motions without feeling the emotions. That morning, I poured David's coffee down the sink and made a decision. Not an angry decision, not a desperate one, just a clear, calm recognition that something had to change. Either we were going to fight for our marriage, really fight for it, or we were going to stop pretending we had one. I called in sick to work, which I never did. Spent the day thinking, walking around our house, looking at photos from happier times, trying to figure out when exactly we'd stopped being us. Was it gradual, like David would later say? Or was there a moment, a specific incident, when we'd chosen comfort over connection? I thought about our last vacation, 8 months earlier. We'd gone to the beach, something we used to love doing, together, but I remembered spending most of the time reading separate books. David checking work emails, despite promising he wouldn't. Both of us taking photos that we posted on social media to prove we were having fun, when really we were just two people sitting near each other in the sand. I thought about our last anniversary. We'd gone to dinner at an expensive restaurant, ordered wine, held hands across the table because it felt like what we were supposed to do, but the conversation had been stilted, full of long pauses, and we'd both seemed relieved when it was over. We'd gone through the motions of celebrating 8 years of marriage, without acknowledging that it felt more like a memorial service for something that had already died. I pulled out a legal pad and started writing, not a letter to David, not an ultimatum, just thoughts, questions I wanted to ask, observations I'd been too polite or too scared to voice, things I missed about us, things that weren't working, things I didn't understand. When David came home, that night, I was sitting at our dining room table with the legal pad covered in my handwriting. He looked surprised to see me there, surprised that I wasn't already in my scrubs, heading out for the night shift. He set down his briefcase, loosened his tie, looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "We need to talk," I said. He sat down, across from me, and I could see him bracing himself. The dining room table we'd bought together, where we'd eaten hundreds of meals, where we'd paid bills and planned vacations and talked about our future. Now it felt like a conference table, in a boardroom. "About what?" he asked, though I think he knew. "About us. About this." I gestured around our perfect, lifeless kitchen. "About the fact that we're not actually married anymore. We're just two people who share a mortgage and a last name." David was quiet for a long time. I watched his face, trying to read what he was thinking, trying to see if there was surprise or relief or sadness there. Finally he said, "I know." Those two words broke my heart and relieved me at the same time. He knew. We both knew. We'd both been walking around this truth for months, stepping carefully around it like it was a sleeping animal we didn't want to wake. "When did it happen?" I asked. "When did we stop being us?" He thought about it. I appreciated that he actually considered the question instead of deflecting or making excuses. "I think it was gradual," he said finally. "Like gaining weight or losing your hearing. You don't notice it happening until one day you can't fit into your favorite jeans, or you realize people have been shouting at you for months." I nodded. That felt right. We hadn't fallen out of love in a single moment. There hadn't been a betrayal or a fight or a crisis that broke us. We'd let love leak out slowly, drop by drop, until we were running on empty. "I don't want to hate you," I said. "I don't want this to turn ugly." "I don't want that either," David said. "I still care about you, Sarah. I think I always will. But I can't pretend we're happy anymore." That opened the floodgates. We talked about when things started feeling different. David admitted he'd been working late sometimes, not because he had to, but because he dreaded coming home to the tension between us. I admitted I'd been picking up extra shifts for the same reason. We both acknowledged that we'd been avoiding each other in our own house, creating separate lives that occasionally intersected around practical matters. We talked about the resentments we'd both been carrying. David felt like I'd stopped showing interest in his work, his goals, his daily experiences. I felt like he'd checked out emotionally, like he was physically present, but mentally elsewhere. We'd both stopped making effort, stopped prioritizing each other, stopped doing the small daily things that keep love alive. "I miss who we used to be," I said at one point, and David nodded. "Me too, but I don't know how to get back there." "Do you want to?" I asked. "Really want to? Enough to do the work it would take?" He was quiet for a long time, longer than I'd expected, which gave me my answer before he spoke. "I don't know," he said finally. And the fact that I don't know probably means no. I appreciated his honesty, even though it hurt. "I don't know either," I admitted. "I think about being single again, and it doesn't scare me the way it used to. It actually feels like relief." We talked about practical things then. The house, the cars, our bank accounts, our families, who would tell whom what, whether we'd try separation first or go straight to divorce, whether there was any point in counseling, if we both felt more excited about the prospect of being apart than about the work of staying together. "I don't want you to think I don't love you," David said around 1 a.m. "I do. But I think I love the memory of us more than I love who we are now." That hit hard, because it was exactly how I felt. We were holding on to a ghost of our former relationship, and both of us were tired of being haunted. We talked until almost 3 a.m. that night, about the good times, which there had been many of, about the ways we'd both changed, grown in directions that took us away from each other, rather than closer, together, about our hopes for the future, which we both realized didn't really include each other anymore. It wasn't angry or bitter. It was sad in the way that endings always are, even necessary ones. We both cried. We both admitted things we should have said months or years earlier. We both acknowledged that we'd been better friends than we were spouses. And maybe that was okay. What do we tell people? I asked. The truth, David said. That we grew apart. That we want different things now. That we're ending this before we start resenting each other. The next few weeks were strange. David slept in the guest room, which actually felt more natural than sharing our bed had in months. We were kinder to each other than we'd been in a long time, probably because we'd finally stopped pretending. We divided up household tasks with more consideration than we'd shown each other in months. We even cooked dinner together a few times, had conversations that felt almost like the old days, except with an expiration date hanging over them. David moved out 3 weeks later. We'd found him a one-bedroom apartment across town, close to his office. We split the furniture as fairly as we could. He took the couch we'd fought about buying, because he'd wanted leather and I'd wanted fabric. We'd compromised on a material that satisfied neither of us, which felt like a metaphor for our entire marriage. I kept the dining room table where we'd had our last real conversation as husband and wife. The first night alone in the house felt different than I'd expected. Not lonely exactly, but quiet in a way that felt peaceful rather than empty. I made dinner for one person, watched a movie David would have hated, went to bed when I felt tired instead of when he did. It felt like coming back to myself. After years of trying to be half of something that hadn't been working, we agreed to sell the house and split the proceeds. Neither of us wanted to live there alone, surrounded by the artifacts of our failed marriage. It sold quickly, staged by a realtor who removed most traces of our life together and replaced them with generic furniture and neutral art. Walking through it one last time, it looked like a movie set version of the life we'd tried to build. The divorce was finalized 8 months later. Irreconcilable differences, which felt both too simple and exactly right. We'd become incompatible in ways that couldn't be fixed with counseling or effort or love. Sometimes people just grow in different directions, like trees planted too close together that eventually start blocking each other's sunlight. I kept working at the hospital, threw myself into my job with an energy I hadn't felt in years. Without the constant background stress of maintaining a failing marriage, I found I was happier at work, more present with my patients, more engaged with my colleagues. Several people commented that I seemed different, lighter somehow. I bought a small condo downtown, furnished it exactly how I wanted it, without consulting anyone or compromising on anything. Every choice was mine, from the paint colors, to the coffee maker, to the art on the walls. It felt like luxury after years of collaborative decision-making that had satisfied neither of us. Dating was the last thing on my mind for the first year after David moved out. I needed time to remember who I was as an individual, what I actually liked and wanted and needed. I took up hobbies David had never been interested in, reconnected with friends I'd lost touch with during the marriage, traveled to places he'd never wanted to go. I saw David at our friend Rachel's wedding 2 years later. I'd been nervous about it for weeks, wondering if seeing him would bring back feelings I'd worked hard to move past. But when I spotted him across the reception venue, my main emotion was curiosity. He looked different, more relaxed somehow, wearing a suit I didn't recognize. He was there with his new girlfriend, a teacher named Claire, who made him laugh in ways I hadn't seen in years. They seemed easy together, comfortable in a way David and I had lost long before we admitted it. I was there with Marcus, a paramedic I'd been dating for 6 months. Marcus knew all my coffee preferences and still asked about my day, like he actually wanted to know. He held my hand during the ceremony and whispered funny observations about the other guests. It felt natural in a way that marriage to David had stopped feeling. David and I talked for a few minutes by the dessert table. He asked about my work, my new place, seemed genuinely interested in the answers. I asked about his job, his family, congratulated him on what seemed like a good relationship with Claire. We were polite, even warm, but like friendly acquaintances, rather than people who'd once planned to grow old together. "You look happy," David said, as we were about to return to our respective dates. "I am," I said, and realized it was true. "You too." "Yeah," he said, glancing over at Claire, who was deep in conversation with Rachel. "I really am." We hugged goodbye, and it felt like closure. Not the angry, dramatic closure you see in movies, but the quiet kind. The recognition that we'd both moved on to better fitting lives. That ending our marriage had been the right choice for both of us. People ask me sometimes if I regret getting divorced. If I wish we'd tried harder, fought longer, worked more to save our marriage. The answer is no. Not because David was a bad person, or because I didn't love him, but because staying would have been unfair to both of us. We deserve to be with people who chose us every day, not just people who are comfortable with us. The breaking point wasn't the coffee that Tuesday morning. It was the realization that we'd both been settling for comfortable instead of fighting for connected, that we'd been so afraid of ending our marriage that we'd forgotten to actually live in it. That love, even real love, isn't always enough if it's not accompanied by genuine liking, respect, curiosity, and the daily choice to prioritize each other. I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is admit when something isn't working. That divorce doesn't always mean failure. Sometimes it means having enough respect for what you once had to let it end with dignity, instead of letting it die slowly from neglect. I kept David's last name for a year after the divorce was final. Not because I was holding on to the past, but because changing it back felt like erasing 8 years of my life that hadn't been entirely bad. We'd had good years, real years. We'd supported each other through losses and celebrated each other's victories. We'd been a team, even if we weren't meant to be a forever team. When I finally did change my name back to Sarah Mitchell, it felt like the last step in becoming myself again. Not the woman I'd been before David, but the woman I'd become because of him, and after him, and despite him. A woman who knew what she wanted in a partnership, who understood the difference between love and compatibility, who wouldn't settle for comfortable if it meant sacrificing truly connected. I kept that legal pad from our final conversation, tucked it away in a box with our wedding photos and the thank you notes from our reception, not as a shrine to what was, but as a reminder of what I learned. That love isn't always enough. That two good people can be wrong for each other. That sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone you care about is let them go find someone who fits them better. Marcus and I moved in together after dating for 2 years. It was different from living with David, easier somehow. We talked about everything, including my marriage and his previous long-term relationship that had ended badly. We both brought baggage, but we unpacked it together instead of pretending it didn't exist. 3 years after that, I married Marcus in a small ceremony in my sister's backyard. 30 people, a potluck dinner, dancing to a playlist we'd made together over months of adding songs we both loved. It felt nothing like my first wedding, which had been elaborate and stressful and focused more on the event than the commitment. David sent a card to that wedding. It was waiting for me when we got back from our honeymoon in Italy, the trip I'd once planned to take with him, but never did. The message was simple. "Congratulations, Sarah. I hope this one sticks." It made me laugh, which I think was the point. No bitterness, no regret, just genuine good wishes from someone who'd known me well enough to understand that I deserved happiness, even if it wasn't with him. The marriage did stick. 8 years now, and counting. Not because Marcus and I don't have problems, but because we've learned to address them when they're still small. Because we ask each other about our days and actually listen to the answers. Because we've both been in relationships that died from neglect, and we're determined not to let it happen again. We have systems now, rules we've developed through trial and error. Wednesday night dinners without phones or laptops. Monthly check-ins, where we talk about what's working and what isn't. Annual relationship goals, like couples therapy or weekend getaways or new shared hobbies. It sounds mechanical maybe, but it's the opposite. It's intentional. It's choosing each other over and over instead of just assuming we'll always be there. Marcus and I fight sometimes. Real fights about money and families and whose turn it is to deal with the broken dishwasher. But we fight like people who want to solve problems, not like people who want to win arguments. And afterward, we talk about what happened, what we each could have done better, how to prevent the same fight next time. Sometimes I think about that Tuesday morning, standing in my kitchen with 2 cups of coffee for one person who is already gone. I think about how different my life might be if I just kept making 2 cups, kept pretending everything was fine, kept choosing comfortable over honest. I'm grateful I chose differently. I'm grateful David and I were brave enough to admit what we both knew, that sometimes the best thing you can do for your marriage is end it before it turns into something bitter and resentful. That sometimes love means knowing when to let go. The breaking point wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and sad, and necessary. It was Tuesday morning coffee, and the realization that I'd rather be alone than lonely in my own marriage. It was choosing truth over comfort, even when the truth was painful. It was the beginning of the rest of my life. The life I'm still building with someone who sees me clearly and chooses me anyway. Someone who makes coffee for 2 people every morning because we both drink it, because we both wake up in the same bed, because we both want to start each day together. Sometimes I run into David around town. He's married to Claire now, has been for 3 years. They have a baby daughter who looks just like him. He seems genuinely happy, settled in a way he never was with me. We wave, sometimes chat, briefly if we're in the same grocery store line or coffee shop. It's comfortable now, friendly even, like running into an old classmate who you remember fondly, but don't particularly miss. That's what a good divorce looks like, I think. Not the absence of love, but the transformation of it into something that serves everyone better. David and I loved each other, but we weren't good at being married to each other. Now we're both good at being married to other people. People who fit us better, challenge us in healthier ways, share our visions for the future. I don't regret the 8 years with David. They taught me what I needed, what I could compromise on, and what I couldn't, what marriage should feel like, and what it shouldn't. Those years weren't wasted. They were preparation. Expensive preparation maybe. Emotionally costly. But necessary for becoming the person who could build something better the second time around. The breaking point was Tuesday morning coffee. But really, it was the accumulation of 1,000 small choices to prioritize comfort over connection, convenience over intimacy, the appearance of marriage over the reality of it. It was the slow recognition that we'd become strangers, living parallel lives, instead of partners, building a shared one. And ultimately, it was the decision to stop settling for a life that looked good from the outside, but felt empty from within. To risk everything we'd built together for the possibility of something more authentic, more alive, more true to who we both deserve to become.